Of course it's not.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
All right, so where am I going? What page?
5.
Okay. All right, there you go. Let me know.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Change in buyer's financial status. If the change in a buyer's financial status affects the buyer's ability to purchase, buyer will promptly notify the seller and lender to whom the buyer submitted a mortgage application, if any, in writing. A change in financial status includes, but not limited to, loss or a change of employment, failure or loss of sale of buyer's home, buyer having accrued a new financial obligation. This happens more times than you could ever imagine. So buyers enter into an agreement of sale, it's executed, everybody's excited, and then they run out and buy $10,000 worth of furniture, B, decide to buy a new car. I can't begin to tell you what these crazy people do. Now, you as a buyer's agent have to inform your buyers that these credit cards that they have to be lost until after closing. They cannot be accruing additional debt. Not for sure does the buyer agent know what the back end ratio is for that buyer, meaning how much more of an obligation can they afford? And putting $10,000 on Raymore and Flanagan is going to possibly throw them up and over. And now they can't afford to buy the house because they've added so much more of a monthly payment. Okay. So make sure you inform your buyers of this. Now, a good loan officer would, on a routine, be talking to the buyers about back-end ratios and not accruing additional cost factors for themselves. But not all loan officers are any good. Okay. Buyer understands that applying for and or accruing any additional financial obligation may affect the buyer's ability to purchase. And that's just what we were speaking about. Okay. Paragraph 10, status of water. Seller represents that the property is served with either A, public water, community water, on-site water, no water. So when you're dealing with the city of Philadelphia, 99% of the time we're going to be dealing with public water, though there are properties, especially in the Northeast, far Northeast, that may also have a well. My son lives in Pine Valley, and there was a well in that property. 2 owners back, you could see the well in the photos. The owner he bought it from had the well removed. So it is possible that there could be both. There could be public and then there could be well water, right? Now, status of sewer. 98% of the time in the city of Philadelphia, we have public sewer. I'm told that there is a block in West Philadelphia that has some sort of a septic system. I know it's crazy, but generally speaking, it's always going to be public. And who knows where to find the status of a particular address in regards to their water and sewer? Where do we determine if it is public or private? Hello? Anybody out there? How do you know? How do you know what kind of water they've got? Can't assume anything in life, right? Because it's going to bite you in the dupa. So how do we find out what the status of an address is in regards to water and sewer? Okay, so we go into the public records. The public records, both in the suburbs and in the city, are going to identify the type of water and sewer system does this property have. All right. In paragraph 10B2, that whole thing talks about when The septic system is not public. And it goes into all kinds of details. We so seldom deal with this. I'm not spending time on this. But note, it does break down the different types of individual sewer systems, holding tanks, and etc. All right. Land use restriction. Oh, excuse me. C, historical preservation. Seller is not aware of historical preservational restrictions regarding the property unless otherwise stated here. What are they speaking about when it says historical preservational restriction? What does that even mean? What are they talking about? Okay. Anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania, there may be a home, and there are many in the city of Philadelphia that have historical rights attached to them. Therefore, when there is a historical preservational restriction, it means just that. That property address has restrictions on what could be done to it, such as facade, windows, tons of things. Where and how do we find out if a property has historical preservational restrictions to it?
Would that also be in the public record?
It is. On the bottom right-hand side, it will identify if there is a historical preservational restriction. There is another place that would identify. All right, I'm going to give you a hint. What form describes the property? In all the paperwork that we have to deal with, what form describes the property? How about the seller's property disclosure statement, right? Now, the seller's property disclosure statement asks that question. Is this property under historical preservational restrictions? That is the responsibility of the seller. Now, about 4 years ago, there was a nasty lawsuit. The buyer agent was newer, had not paid attention to look up if the property, you always go to public records. Go to public records if you represent the seller. You go to public records if you represent the buyer, and you look it over. For whatever reason, it was missed that this particular property had a historical preservational restriction. Now, don't think that the property has to be 200 years old to have it. That's incorrect. In Old City, there are properties built in the 70s that have historical preservational restrictions. That's how they got them to look like they're 200 years old, but they're not really 200 years old. They're only 40, 50, 60 years old. So this lawsuit was buyer buys a property, had no idea there was a historical preservational restriction. After closing, the buyer's out front with a contractor. Neighbor goes by and says, "Hey, what you doing?" Buyer says, "Oh, these windows are caca. I got to get them out. I got to put new windows in." He said, "What are you talking about? You got to put new windows in?" He goes, "These things are terrible." He said, "You can't put new windows in." He goes, "What do you mean I can't put new windows in?" He said, "This whole block is a historical preservational restricted block. You can't change the windows." Well, that precipitated phone calls to attorneys, and that was a nasty lawsuit. Not only did the buyer agent miss it, but guess what? It gets even better. The seller was a licensed PA realtor who did not identify that on the seller's property disclosure statement. Ooh, that was very ugly. Okay, so let's be real careful with that. It then goes on to say land use restrictions. This property or portions of it is subject to land use restrictions and may be preferentially, I'm saying that incorrectly, assessed for tax purposes under the following act. If it's an agricultural area, farmland, open space, conservation reserve. Well, that's probably not going to happen in the city anywhere. And again, if it's in the burbs, you would be hopefully finding that on the tax records if it is. But that's, again, something that's rarely used. When it talks about notice regarding land use restriction, Pennsylvania Right to Farm Act, clean and green programs, open space, conservation reserve. These are just things that you might want to keep in the back of your mind. E, real estate seller disclosure law. Generally, the real estate seller disclosure law requires that before the agreement of sale is signed, the seller in a residential real estate transfer must make certain disclosures regarding the property to potential buyers in a form defined by the law. A residential real estate transfer is defined as a sale, exchange, installment, sales contract, lease with option to buy, grant or other transfer of the interest of real property, where not less than one and not more than 4 residential units are involved. And it's interesting, notice how big the font is there. Not less than one and not more than 4 residential dwelling units. In the mortgage world, when an individual is purchasing a parcel with a building on it and improvement, and it has more than 4 units, it becomes a commercial loan. You're out of the residential world, okay? Disclosure for condominium and cooperatives are limited to the seller's particular unit when they're filling out that form. They're not talking about the building, only their unit within their walls. Disclosures regarding common area or faculties are not required, as those elements are already addressed in the laws that govern the resale of condominium and cooperative interest. Public and or private assessments. Seller represents, as of the date the seller signed the agreement, no public improvement, condominium or homeowner association assessments have been made against the property, which remain unpaid, and that no notice by any government or public authority, excluding assessed value, have been served upon the seller or anyone on seller's behalf, including notices relating to violations of zoning, housing, building safety, and fire ordinance that remain uncorrected, and that the seller knows of no condition that would constitute a violation of any such ordinance that remain uncorrected unless otherwise specified here. Okay. Got a phone call today. One of my agents listed a distressed property. It goes under agreement of sale. To find out there are violations against the property. So I said to the agent 2 things. 1, you represented the seller, and did the seller indicate in the seller's property disclosure statement that there are violations? Answer was no. Now we know darn right well that seller knows that there's violations. The city of Philadelphia has been mailing them wonderful letters for a long time. Number 2, I said, shame on you. Everyone needs to check. Go to phila.gov, punch up an address, and look and see if there's violations against a property. It's part of your due diligence to confirm this. And when the seller is signing off on a contract, these lines, such as line 283 or 285, would have to be filled in if they knew of violations against the property. Okay. H, highway occupancy permit. Access to a public road may require insurance of a highway occupancy permit from the Department of Transportation. That's sort of like an FYI thing. And perhaps you're selling a parcel that has a long lane and the access to it is only from a highway. There may be some sort of attachment to it on the deed that says that that parcel always has to have access to a main highway. It's not something you would typically say. H. Now, H, paragraph H, is new this year, and it's called Internet of Things. I think it's fascinating, the name of this. Internet of Things devices. The presence of smart and green home devices that are capable of the connection to the internet, directly or indirectly, and the data stored on those various devices make up a digital ecosystem in the property, sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the Internet of Things devices may transmit data to a third party outside of the control of the owner. On or before settlement, seller will make a reasonable effort to clear all data stored on all of the Internet of Things devices located on the property and included in the sale. Seller further acknowledges that all personal devices owned by the seller, included but not limited to cellular phones, personal computers, and tablets, having connective to any of the Internet of Things devices located in the property, will be disconnected and cleared of the relevant data prior to settlement. Further, no attempt will be made after settlement by seller or anyone on seller's behalf to access any of the Internet of devices remaining on the property. Following settlement, buyer will make a reasonable effort to clear all stored data from any Internet of Things and devices remaining on the property and to restrict access to said devices by the seller, seller's agent, or a third party to whom the seller may have previously provided access. This includes, but not limited to, restoring the Internet of Things devices to original settings, changing passwords or codes, updating network settings, and submitting change of ownership and contact information to device manufacturers and service providers. This paragraph will survive settlement. If any of you happen to get involved with a smart or green house, you need to be asking questions. Are there Internet devices? Internet of Things? If so, who's the third party vendor? How do we clear them? What are we doing here? What if you're the buyer agent on a very expensive house that has one? You need to confirm that these things are going to be erased and handled prior to closing. Waiver of contingencies. In this agreement is contingent on buyer's right to inspect and or repair the property, or to verify insurability, environmental conditions, boundaries, certifications, zoning classifications or use, or any other information regarding the property. Buyer's failure to exercise any of buyer's options within the time set forth in this agreement is a waiver of that contingency. And buyer accepts the property and agrees to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. So what does that mean? As we go on further into the home inspection and the options of contingency, so what we're going to inspect, if a buyer chooses all of these contingencies because he was not properly advised by his buyer agent, yet does not perform the duty for those inspections after the time indicated, and the general time is 10 days, but that could be altered. So if the time is 10 days and within 10 days they do not do their due diligence, it disappears. The ability to then go back and say, I need to do my due diligence doesn't exist anymore. It expired with the 10 days. Buyer's due diligent inspections. Right and responsibilities. Seller will provide access to insurers, representatives, and, as may be required by this agreement or by mortgage lenders, to the surveyors, municipal officers, appraisers, and inspectors. In addition, unless otherwise agreed, only parties and their real estate licensees are to attend any inspections. So right now, according to the guidelines of the state of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, how many people can be in a property at one time?
3.
3. So with that said, if there is a buyer having a home inspection, technically, it is advantageous for the buyer agent to be there. But if it's a husband and wife, can you be there? No. You may want to bring this to the attention of your buyers and say, perhaps one of you are not going to go through the inspection so that I can be here, hear what's being said, take notes. Even though a full report comes, there's a big difference in reading a report about a deficiency and being there and talking about it and seeing the deficiency. So it's really important that you as the agent are there for home inspections. Buyer may make 2 pre-settlement walkthrough inspections of the property for the limited purpose of determining that the condition of the property is as required by the agreement and any addenda. Buyer's rights to these inspections will not be waived by any other provision of the agreement. What do you think that last sentence means? Buyer's rights to these inspections is not waived by any other provision of the agreement. Anybody have an idea? No? Okay. So let's say what that means is, even if the buyer has waived all inspections and is taking the property in its as-is condition, they still have a right to do 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs. None of that changes. With or without due diligence, they still have that right. Seller will have heating and all utilities, including fuels, on for the inspection and appraisal. If you're working with a buyer who's purchasing a property that is as is, where is, all that happy stuff, and you walk through the property and you know it has no utilities on, they have to go on if this is going to be a mortgage transaction, because a mortgage transaction is going to have an appraisal. The appraiser has to confirm that the heat is working, that the electricity is on. Home inspectors have to have electricity on to do their inspections. Okay, now, if the seller is doing no home inspection, but he is obtaining a mortgage, let's say it's habitable. Let's say it's just a grandmom house, right? You know, it's got good bones. Grandmom lived there 50, 60 years. She did her very best with her Social Security check. But, you know, it's a 50-year-old kitchen and 60-year-old bathrooms and whatever it is, right? But it functions. If there's going to be an appraisal, you have to have utilities on. Now, listing agents can smell green, and they know immediately you're a new agent. You guys can't help yourselves. It just oozes out of your skin. And they're going to say to you, oh, honey, you bought this as is. We're not responsible for turning on the utilities. Well, see, now you know where to look. And you go, yes, but excuse me, in paragraph 12A3, in bold type, it says that the seller will have this on. Be careful, because if that becomes an issue, the clock is still ticking on your due diligence period, which will have to be altered. Because if you send the home inspector out there and or the appraiser and these utilities are not on, now the buyer has to pay again to have that professional come back out. Okay, so let's be careful. Pay attention to the utilities. All inspectors, including home inspectors, are authorized by buyer to provide a copy of any inspection report to the broker for the buyer. Well, that would be you, right? If you're the buyer's agent. Seller has a right upon request to receive a free copy of any inspection report from the party for whom it was prepared. Unless otherwise stated, underline this sentence. Seller does not have a right to receive a copy of any lender's appraisal report. The appraisal is only for the buyer. So, because you guys smell like green, you're going to have a listing agent say, hey, Vic, listen, I know the appraiser went out the other day. I didn't get that report. Can you send that to me? How do we answer that? No. Well, why can't I have it? Oh, well, because it says here in the agreement of sale, seller does not have a right to receive a copy of any lender's appraisal report. Now, that's pretty much a blanket statement, except when an appraisal comes under purchase price. Now we've got to renegotiate. Now you do need to share that with the seller and the seller's agent. But if everything's hunky-dory, it comes in at purchase price or greater, yay to your buyer. They have instant equity. We don't want to tell the seller that, because now they're going to get pissy because they think they should have got more for their property. Okay? All right. So we're not doing that. Buyer waives or elects buyer's expense to have the following inspections, certifications, and investigations referred to as inspection or inspections performed by professional contractor, home inspector, engineer, architect, and other properly licensed or otherwise qualified professional. All inspections shall be non-invasive unless otherwise agreed to in writing. If the same inspector is inspecting more than one system, so what type of inspector might that be? Who's going to inspect more than one system? What kind of person is that? It's a home inspector, right? He inspects all kinds of variables. The inspector must comply with the home inspection law and notice regarding property and environmental inspections. For elected inspections, buyer will, within the contingency period stated in paragraph 13A, we're not there yet, but in that time frame, and we're going to use 10 for our class today because that's a standard kind of time frame. Within that 10-day period, the buyer has to complete the inspections, obtain an inspection report or results referring to as report or reports, and accept the property, terminate this agreement, or submit a written corrective proposal to the seller according to the terms of paragraph 13B. So the buyer has 10 days from what point to do their inspections? At what point does the 10 days start?
Execution of the agreement of sale.
Execution of the agreement of sale. That's correct. So from the time of the execution, the buyer has 10 days to A, get the home inspector out there, B, review the home inspection report that's sent back to them, decide if they're going to put together a reply to home inspection, a wish list to the seller. And then within that time frame, hope, because then the seller has 5 days, that we'll be able to have a meeting of the minds. But those actions that the buyer needs to do have to happen within 10 days. Okay? Now, what kind of inspections can we do? Well, the first one is a home property inspection and environmental hazards such as mold or etc. Buyer may conduct an inspection of the property, structural components, roof, exterior windows and exterior doors, exterior building material, fascia, gutter and downspouts, swimming pools, hot tubs and spas, appliances, electrical systems, interior and exterior plumbing, public sewer systems, heating and cooling systems, water penetration, electromagnetic fields, wetland and floodplain delineation, structural square footage. Whose opinion of structural square footage is acceptable? What type of professional can determine structural square footage? Can the home inspector? Well, the answer is no. The two professions of which structural square footage is considered accurate is an appraiser and an architect. They're the only two people that really count. Mold and other environmental hazards such as fungi, indoor air quality, asbestos, underground storage tanks, and any other items buyer may select. If buyer elects to have a home inspection of the property, as defined in the home inspection law, the home inspection must be performed by a full member in good standings of a National Home Inspection Association, or a person supervised by a full member of the National Home Inspection Association, in accordance with the ethical standards and codes of conduct or practice of that association, or by a properly licensed and registered engineer or architect. Okay, here's a scenario. You have a young lady, single lady, you've been taken around showing houses, and you really found this great little place for her. She loves it. You put the offer in, and bada bing, bada boom, your offer was accepted. Yay! Okay, so now the next thing we got to do is we got to get our home inspection done, right? So in talking to the young lady, she says, listen, I know the next thing we got to do is our home inspection, and I want Uncle Joe to do my home inspection. Oh, well, here's a question. Can Uncle Joe do the home inspection? No? Yes? Can somebody answer me? Are you really out there?
No, they're not.
Okay, well, why not?
Because they need to be a PA licensed inspector
So,
and certified.
and or, because it does specify, and or a properly licensed or registered engineer or architect. Okay. So how do we address your buyer who wants Uncle Joe to be there? Because, you know, Daddy passed away a few years ago, and Uncle Joe really has come up to the plate. And she's always been there. He's always been there for her. And she trusts Uncle Joe. And you know, he knows so much. He built a cabin up in the Poconos. It's gorgeous. Vaulted ceiling, beautiful. How do we address that? We have standards according to the agreement of sale, but you have a desire by a buyer to have someone who doesn't fall into the requirements for a home inspection. How do you handle that?
Well, if she does want to go with him, we would have to waive it then because it wouldn't count as a home inspection, correct?
So
I
we
mean, we
all,
could try to get her not to do that, but
right.
if she absolutely did, it would have to be waived.
So what's going to happen here is this. Waiving inspections is never a smart move, right? So how about we do something like this? The conversation goes like this. You say to her, you know, I really understand why you want Uncle Joe there. You know, I mean, you and I have been working together for 3 or 4 weeks, and you've spoke of him so often, and you know, it's truly you respect him. There's no question about it. But here's my thought. If Uncle Joe was perhaps missed something that was significant, and you're left holding the bag with a repair, replacement, and or etc., it's going to make Thanksgiving so awkward. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, let's get the professional guy in there, right? Because he does this all day, every day. And God forbid something goes awry, he's bonded, insured, and all that fun stuff, right? But how about we have Uncle Joe come too? How about Uncle Joe comes? So that will help meet your needs for him to be there. And he can ask questions because he's so knowledgeable. And he and the home inspector can go through this together with you. What are your thoughts on that? I find it hard for any counter rebuttal to that would be negative. She gets what she wants, Uncle Joe to be there. We have a licensed, insured, respectable, ethical individual doing the inspection. We've kind of made the best of 2 worlds. Make sense? Yeah, okay. Let's now talk about wood infestation. Buyer may obtain a written wood destroying insect infestation inspection report. That's a mouthful. From an inspector certified as a wood destroying pesticide applicator, and will deliver it and all supporting documents and drawings provided by the inspector to the seller. The report is to be made satisfactory to and in compliance with applicable laws, mortgage lender requirements. FYI, mortgage lender requirements. If this transaction is an FHA or VA transaction, and your buyer initialed off that they elected to do wood destroying or wood infestation, they are then mandated to do it. FHA and VA will not let that slide. They have to do it. Conventional, not so much. But FHA, VA, once it's been initialed off that they've elected, then they must do it. And or federally insured and guaranteed agency requirements. The inspection is to be limited to all readily visible and accessible areas of all structures of the property except for fencing. If the inspection reveals active infestation, buyer at buyer's expense may obtain a proposal from a wood destroying pesticide applicator to treat the property. If the inspection reveals damage from active or previous infestation, buyer may obtain a written report from a professional contractor home inspector, or structural engineer that is limited to the structural damage of the property caused by wood destroying organisms and a proposal to repair the property. Because a home has active termites or powder puff beetles or wood boring ants, doesn't mean that the transaction is in the toilet. What two rivers does Philadelphia sandwich between? Philadelphia sandwich between two rivers.
Delaware and Schuylkill.
Yeah. Guess what? We're wet.
Hmm.
We are a wet environment. And wood boring insects like damp wet. Because termite comes back positive is not the end of the deal here. Especially if there's no evidence of significant deterioration of or damage caused by the wood boring insect. The integrity of the joist are still great. Just because some little bug got in there doesn't mean he destroyed the whole joist, right? Especially the older the house is. When I refer often to that 2-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house in South Philly, their joists are so thick because they're over 100 years old. They're much thicker and larger than more modern properties. So it takes a lot more munching for a termite to cause any integrity issues with that joist, okay? So let's not get panicky. We're going to get it corrected. We're going to get it treated, all right? It's going to be okay. That's what your interpretation of this. It's going to be okay, all right? Deed restrictions and zoning. Buyer may investigate easements, deed and use restrictions, including any historical preservational restrictions and ordinances that apply to the property. That means the buyer can investigate that, right? And review local zoning ordinances. Buyer may verify that the present use of a property, such as an in-law quarter, apartments, home office, daycare, commercial, or recreational vehicle parking is permitted and may elect to make the agreement contingent upon the applicable use. Tough words there. Okay. Buyer may obtain an inspection of the quality and quantity of the water system from a properly licensed or otherwise qualified water well testing company. If and as required by the inspection company, seller at seller's expense will locate and provide access to the on-site or individual water system. Seller will restore the property to its previous condition at seller's expense prior to settlement. All right, so let's talk about that. If this property has public water, the buyer still has a right, even with public water, to have an inspection company come out and evaluate the water coming out of the tap. Now, does that ever really happen? Nope. But I will tell you this. As a rule of thumb, I have found if the property is 90 years or older, there is a possibility that the type of pipe coming into the house, bringing in the water, could be lead. And we all know lead is bad juju. When you're at the inspection and you have an older home, it is important you ask the home inspector to determine the material of the piping bringing the water into the house. Now, when you write the offer, you don't have that information. I'm going to suggest if the property is 90 years or older, you elect the water service Reason being, if it should come back lead 10 days later when you do your home inspection report, you're not going to have a listing agent go, oh, wait a minute. You didn't say you were like getting involved with any water issue here. And they start making your life difficult. Elect to have water service. When you send this over, and the listing agent is actually somebody who reads these things and calls you up and says, hey, thanks for sending over the offer, but I was just wondering, why did you elect the water service? It's public water. And that's when you respond to the reason. I don't know what type of piping, material of piping is bringing the water into the house. You're going to look really, really smart in front of that agent. Okay? Radon. Who knows what radon is? Hello? Anybody out there? Tell me what radon is?
It's like a natural gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but what about the natural gas?
It's toxic.
It's radioactive. There you go. So it says here, buyer may obtain a radon test of a property from a certified inspector. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, also known as EPA, advises corrective action if the average annual exposure to radon is equal to or higher than 0.02 working levels or 4 picocurie liters. And generally that 4 picocurie is how it is identified. Radon is a natural radioactive gas that is produced in the ground by normal decay of uranium and rhenium. Studies indicate that extended exposure to high levels of radon gas can increase the risk of lung cancer. Radon can find its way into any airspace and can permeate a structure of any house. If a house has a radon problem, it usually can be cured by increasing ventilation and or by preventing radon entry. Any person who tests, mitigates, or safeguards a building for radon in Pennsylvania must be certified by the Department of Environmental Protection. Information about radon and about certified test or mitigation firms are available through the Office of the Department of Environmental Protection. Okay. This is when you got to pay attention. You're working with buyers and they jibber jabber constantly. They're talking about this and they're talking about that and they're talking about this. And most of the time you're kind of like tuning it out. But then your ears pop up. Your ears pop up because you're in the lower level, you're in the basement. And the potential buyer says, oh my God, this basement is really cool. It's got 9-foot ceilings. You know, I could convert this to a room for my teenage son. Or my son who just finished college and doesn't have a job yet. I can make this his man cave. Your ears better pop up immediately. And so the question I'm asking you is why? Why do they have to pop up immediately and pay attention?
Because the radon could pop really high in the basement and that would be really dangerous, spend a long amount of time down there.
Yep. And what other reason? It's a safety reason. Think about it.
Oh, because of entrances down there?
Right. How many means of egress are there to the property? How many ways can somebody get out of the basement? Excuse me. So if that staircase from the kitchen to the basement is on fire, how is Junior getting out of the basement? Junior's not getting out of the basement. This is when you have to start opening your mouth and you say to them, wait a minute. There is no second means of egress here. If there is a fire, how is whomever is down here getting out? Right? So the radon, long-term exposure, we're not talking about running down, taking the wash from the washing machine, throwing it in the dryer, throwing another load in and running upstairs. That's 15 minutes. No, we're talking 8, 10, 12 hours down there at any given period. Because if Junior's over 21, he's scoring a load over the weekend and he's sleeping till Saturday at noon or Sunday to noon, right? Long-term exposure. So it is your job to inform these people of the safety risks, both with radon and fire. Okay, really important. On-site sewage. Buyer may obtain an inspection from an individual on an on-lot sewage disposal system, which may include a hydraulic load test from a qualified professional inspector, if and as required by the inspection company. Seller at seller's expense will locate, provide access to, empty the individual on-lot sewage disposal system, and provide all water needed unless otherwise agreed. Seller will restore the property to its previous condition at seller's expense prior to settlement. Okay. If a property does not have public sewer, do not let this absolutely fabulous buyer convince you they don't need to spend the money to have this checked. A deficiency in a sewer system can run $5,000 to $30,000. No, absolutely not. It must be inspected. Property and flood insurance. Buyer may determine the insurability of a property by making application for property and casualty insurance for the property to a reasonable insurer. Broker for the buyer, if any. Otherwise, broker for the seller may communicate with the insurer to assist in the insurance process. If the property is located in a specifically designated flood zone, buyer may be required to carry flood insurance at buyer's expense, which may need to be ordered 14 days or more prior to settlement. Revised flood maps and change in federal laws may subsequently increase future flood insurance premiums or require insurance for formerly exempted properties. Buyers should consult with one or more flood insurance agents regarding the need for flood insurance and possible premium increases. Boundary line disputes. Buyer may engage the service of a surveyor, title abstract, or other qualified professional to assist in the legal description, certainty, and location of boundaries and or quadrants of land. Most sellers, important, underline this next line. Most sellers have not had the property surveyed, as it is not a requirement of property transfer in Pennsylvania. Any fences, hedges, walls, and other natural or constructed boundaries may or may not represent a true boundary line of the property. Any numerical representation of size of the property or approximates only and may be inaccurate. Lead-based paint hazards. Before a buyer is obligated to purchase a residential dwelling built prior to 1978, buyer has the option to conduct a risk assessment and or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. Regardless of whether the inspection is elected or waived, residential lead-based paint hazard Reduction Act requires, oops, I read the wrong line. Oh, lead hazard information pamphlet titled, Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home. So a buyer has to have this brochure, this booklet, along with a separate form attached to this agreement, disclosing seller's knowledge of lead-based paint hazards and any lead-based paint recordings regarding the property. Then we have other, and other is just sort of a generic. What might a buyer want inspected that is not pre-printed here in this paragraph?
Stucco.
Yeah, our favorite.
Love it.
Stucco. Stucco is a thorn in everybody's side.
Mhm.
What else might be done? Maybe, and I'm going to tell you, if the property a buyer is purchasing is either a rehab or new construction, I strongly recommend you have the sewer line scoped with a camera, especially rehab. Rehab, God knows who did the rehab and the quality of their workmanship, let alone what went down that kitchen drain. It's so common that they clean their tools at the kitchen sink of spackle. Spackle goes down the drain and settles into these pipes. And because it's not continuously being flushed on a regular basis with water running through it, it hardens and blocks the sewer line. So common, 2 days after you settle on a rehab, you get a phone call that water is gushing out of a drain in the basement because the sewer line is now cracked and or blocked. New construction, you would hope, is a higher quality of a professional, but don't guarantee any of that. So if you're selling new construction and or a rehab, definitely you want to have that sewer line scoped for sure. No question about it.
And what kind of inspector would that be? Like, who would we be contacting?
Okay, so that's a licensed plumber who specializes in cameras,
Okay.
right? And they drop it down the camera. Especially rehabs, they're not replacing the sewer line. That sewer line can be 100 years old. So we don't know if there's cracks in it. Notice regarding property and environmental inspection. So some of the things are going to give you some hints on that you could have done. And the first one says exterior building material. Poor or improper installation of exterior building material may result in moisture penetrating the surface of the structure where it may cause mold or damage to the building frame. So what are they talking about? Number one there, D1. What is that? Stucco, right? Asbestos. Environmental hazards in general, wetland, mold, fungi, indoor air quality, and then there is additional information on how to reach EPA if you have other questions. All right, now we're going to talk about the inspection contingency. So we figured out in paragraph 12, what are all the special things that special types of inspections can we do? And we've identified what we're doing and what we're not doing. Now is how do we play the game in paragraph 13? How does all this break down in timelines? 12 just gave us the options of what to choose. Paragraph 13 is going to tell us how we perform this. The contingency period is blank, 10 days if not specified. from the execution date of the agreement for each inspection elected in 12C. All right, so they said, listen, you got 10 days to do whatever you chose in the paragraph before. Within the stated contingency period, and as the result of any inspection elected in 12C, except as stated in paragraph 13C. This is how it's going to go down. If the results of the inspection elected in paragraph 12C are satisfactory to the buyer will present all reports in their entirety to the seller, accept the property with the information stated in the reports, and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. Yay, that's easy. We're going to take the property how it is. Or if the results of the inspection elected in paragraph 12C are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all reports in their entirety to the seller and terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller, with all deposit monies returning to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of this agreement. Buyer's like, holy mackerel, this place is a hot mess. I'm getting the heck out of this. I'm running in the woods like my hair's on fire. I'm out of here. Okay. Or maybe if the results of the inspection elected in paragraph 12C are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all reports in their entirety to the seller, but with a written corrective proposal listing corrections and/or credits desired by the buyer. Oh, okay. So the buyer says, we got some bumps and bruises. I got to get the seller to do something with some of these. So we can either ask to have them repaired, or maybe we could get a monetary credit towards the repair. Now, in regards to the monetary credit, remember, seller's assist. There are caps on seller's assist. Loan institutions consider a monetary adjustment for a home inspection as seller's assist. If you have already maxed out your seller's assist, according to the guidelines of the type of mortgage you're getting, we can't do that then, can we? We cannot get cash back to make those repairs. So pay attention. Make sure this loan officer has got both eyes open and knows what the heck's going on here, okay? Because you're going to be in a hot mess. All right. Now, the proposal may, this paragraph is really important. Pay attention here. The proposal may, but is not required to, include the name of the properly licensed or qualified professional to perform the corrections requested in the proposal, provisions for payments, including retesting, and a projected date of completion of the corrections. Buyer agrees that seller will not be held liable for corrections that do not comply with mortgage lender or government requirements, if performed in a workmanlike manner according to the terms of the buyer's proposal. So, if you cannot accept a monetary credit and you are asking for repairs to be done, that paragraph is saying to you, you as the buyer's agent can identify who is going to do the repairs. Doesn't have to fall in the lap of the seller to get a non-professional qualified individual to make the repairs. You can say, I want all the electrical issues indicated in the report to be corrected and repaired by Jack Flash Electric. Now the seller has to agree that they're going to accept Jack Flash Electric, who is licensed and insured, to come into their property and make those repairs at the cost of the seller. Now you know the quality of workmanship because Jack Flash you've used for years, who comes highly recommended and is a true professional in his industry. You get some of these sellers, God only knows what the heck's going in there. Now, you run into a problem when you're in a rehab because you have a GC, and the GC is going to have his guy go in and do it. You're going to have a fight with that. But when it's just a standard resale property, you have a better shot of getting the seller to pay for the professional you want because you know the quality of the workmanship that's going to happen. Okay? So that helps a lot. Following the end of the contingency period, buyer and seller will have 5 days, if not specified, for the negotiating period during the negotiating period. Okay. So we've had 10 days to get the report, to get the inspection done, report back, make a wish list, send it over to the seller. We've got 10 days to do that. Now, the seller has 5 days to decide what they're going to do. Remember, it indicates repetitively in these paragraphs at the end of the contingency period. Everything is at the end of the contingency period. So with that said, more and more buyer agents wait to the 10th day to turn it in. Realtors cannot do math. And for that reason, the confusion and mistakes on dates are much less. So let's pretend. Here's a good example. You show the property on January the 2nd. You write the offer on January the 4th. January 5th, the offer is executed. What is the last day the buyer can turn in their reply to home inspection?
15th day.
15th day. How did you come up with
The 15th.
How did you come up with that?
I counted from the second day after. The first day is the day after you execute. So that's number
Right.
one, day one.
So if the execution date is the 5th, use these. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, but what if you didn't turn it in on the 10th? You turned it in on the 8th day. Not the 10th day, the 8th day. What day is the last day the seller can respond to your reply to inspection?
20th. They
Any
still
other?
They still have the 10 days and then still 5 days.
But 10 and 5 is 15. So you're right. It would be the 20th.
20th. Okay.
Everything is based off of the end. Even though you turned it in early, you still have to wait those 2 days to finish our 10 days. And now we have to wait 5 more days for the seller's 5 days. Right? Realtors can't do math. Don't hurry up and turn it in. Odds are you're going to run into problems. Turn it in on the 10th day. Seems to keep things a little bit more in control. All right. Now, it then says, seller will acknowledge in writing seller's agreement to satisfy the terms of buyer's proposal. So by the end of the 5 days that the seller has had to make a decision, they come back and they say, listen, we're going to fix everything you want done. Yay! We're so excited. Or does the seller say, buyer and seller will negotiate another mutual acceptable written agreement, providing for any repairs or improvements to the property and or any credit to buyer at settlement as acceptable to a mortgage lender. So the seller says, listen, I'm not going to fix all your stuff. You want A, B, and C done. I'm not fixing A, B, and C. I'm going to fix A and B. Buyer says, okay, I can live with that. So now a new addendum is drawn up, but only A and B, we all agreed to, is going to be fixed. The seller has 4 choices when they get the reply to home inspection. First choice, seller can say, oh my God, I'm going to fix everything. Don't you worry about it. Whew, that's fabulous. Or the seller can say, I'll tell you what, you want A, B, and C fixed. I'll fix A and B, but I'm not fixing C. Third choice the seller has, hey lady, I'm not fixing anything. Fourth choice is, not going to fix anything, but I'll credit you some money so you can fix it. They're the 4 options that a seller has. One of those 4 things are going to happen, okay? So it's important we pay attention to that. Now, it then says, seller agrees to satisfy all the terms of the buyer's proposal, or buyer and seller enter into another mutual acceptable written agreement of sale. Buyer then accepts the property and agrees to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement, and the negotiating period ends. Yay! Except if no mutual acceptable written agreement is reached, or if seller fails to respond during the negotiating period. So that's that 5-day period. Seller goes underground. Can't find them. Listing agent says, I've texted, I've called, I've emailed. I don't know what to tell you. The guy went underground. Within blank days, 2, if not specified, from that day 15. Following the end of the negotiating period. So that means day 16 and 17. Buyer will either accept the property with the information stated in the report and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement, or they're going to terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller, with all deposit monies returning to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of this agreement. If buyer and seller do not reach a mutual acceptable written agreement, and buyer does not terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller within the allotted time, buyer will accept the property and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. Ongoing negotiations do not automatically extend the negotiating period. That's very important. Agents get all tangled up with zigzagging back and forth, and they don't pay attention to their dates. Just because you're zigzagging doesn't mean you get an extension. You have to apply for an extension. Zigzagging doesn't count. Now, this next paragraph is going to talk about individual on-lot sewage disposal systems. And if there's a deficiency, how this is handled. Since it's so rare that we deal with this, I'm not going over that. But if you have a deficiency in a septic system or private sewer system, this is how you handle it. Make sense? All right. We're going to go on to title insurance. Within blank days, 7, if not specified, from the execution date of the agreement. 7 days is pretty fast. I usually alter that to around 20 or 25 days, depending, as long as this is a 60-day closing. If for some reason this transaction goes in the toilet and your buyer has ordered from a reputable title company, title insurance and search, they may have a fee if they cancel. So to prevent your buyer from having to pay a fee, if we get to the home inspection and we realize we're getting out because it's a mess, Okay, so I generally alter that. Buyer will order from a reputable title company for delivery to seller a comprehensive title report on the property. Upon receipt, buyer will deliver a free copy of the title report to the seller. Buyer is encouraged to obtain an owner's title insurance policy to protect the buyer. An owner's title insurance policy is different from a lender's title insurance property, which will not protect the buyer from claims and attacks on the title. Owner's title insurance policies come in standard and enhanced versions. Buyers should consult with a title insurer agent about buyer's options. Buyer agrees to release and discharge any and all claims and losses against the broker for the buyer. Should the buyer elect to obtain an owner, if buyer should elect to obtain an owner's title insurance policy, should say, should elect not to elect. The only time you're going to find a buyer generally who does not want title insurance is somebody who's an idiot or somebody who may be purchasing a family member title. If you have a buyer who insists, and if it's a mortgage transaction, they don't have a choice. It would only be a cash transaction that they would even have a choice. But if it's a cash transaction and they choose not to obtain title insurance, you must put in writing an addendum stating that the buyer has been instructed and encouraged to obtain title insurance. Buyer has decided not to obtain title insurance, and have them sign off. In a court of law, that piece of paper will be priceless. Okay? And then it says, buyer will pay for the following: title search, title insurance, and or mechanic lien insurance, or any fee for cancellation, flood insurance, fire insurance, hazard insurance, and or any fee for cancellation, appraisal fee, and charges paid in advance to a mortgage lender, buyer's customary settlement costs and accrueds, any survey or surveys required by the title insurance company or abstract company for preparing an adequate legal description of the property or the corrections thereof will be obtained and paid for by the seller. Any survey or surveys desired by the buyer or required by a mortgage lender will be obtained and paid for by the buyer. The property will convey with good and marketable title that is insurable by a reputable title insurance company at the regular rates, free and clear of all liens and encumbrances and easements, excepting, however, the following existing deed restrictions, historical preservational restrictions or ordinance, building restrictions, ordinances, easements of road, easements visible upon the ground, easements of recording, and privileges or rights of public service companies, if any. In the event of a change in seller's financial status, affecting the seller's ability to convey title to the property on or before settlement, or any extension thereof, seller shall promptly notify the buyer in writing. Any change in financial status against the seller included of public tax sale. Oops, wait a minute. I read that wrong. A change in financial status includes, but is not limited to, seller filing for bankruptcy, filing for foreclosure, lawsuit against the property, enter of a monetary judgment against the seller, notice of public tax sale affecting the property, and seller learning that the sales price of the property is no longer sufficient to satisfy all liens or encumbrances against the property. What is that called when the seller learns that the sale price of the property will no longer satisfy all liens and encumbrances? It's called a short sale. That is when the property's value is less than, according to the agreement of sale, than the outstanding balances owed on the property. Short sale. That's when the seller goes to the mortgage lender and says, listen, I'm underwater. The neighborhood went south. I maxed out on my equity line of credit and my mortgage. The two of them exceed the purchase price of any home in the neighborhood. I got to get out. I'm losing my job in 90 days. That's when the bank takes over. And with the cooperation of the seller, the bank makes a business decision that they're willing to accept less than what is owed on the property. That is known as a short sale. Okay. If seller is unable to give good and marketable title that is insurable by a reputable title insurance company at the regular rates as specified in paragraph 14A, buyer may terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller. All deposit monies returned to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of the agreement. Upon termination, seller will reimburse buyer for any costs that accrued by buyer for any inspection certifications obtained according to the terms of this agreement, and for those items specified in paragraph 14C, 1, 2, 3, paragraph 14D. If the seller cannot give clear and marketable title, technically the buyer can request to be reimbursed for inspections, certifications, mortgage application, appraisal fee paid for. Now, the odds of getting that are pretty slim, but technically the buyer has the right to request that. Oil, gas, mineral, and other rights of this property may have been previously conveyed or leased, and seller makes no representation about the status of those rights unless indicated elsewhere in this agreement. So there's a little checkbox of which, if you were going to include this addendum, it would be for oil, gas, and mineral right addendums. Where does that ever play into this? How about up in the Poconos with fracking, right? Remember, this agreement of sale is for the entire state of Pennsylvania. So if you're accidentally representing somebody up there and it was in the MLS that the seller has fracking rights, you want them to be able to be transferred over to the new owner. So you're going to need that addendum. It also talks about on page 10, coal notice. Again, we're not mining for any coal around here, but you might be up in the Poconos somewhere. So that whole paragraph there, or that whole section, would apply for cabins, coal rights, any special transferred fee obligation to a private property, none of which I've ever seen before, but you need to know it's there. Notice of assessment and municipal requirements. In the event any notice of public and or private assessments as described in paragraph 10F, excluding assessed values, or received after seller has signed this agreement and before settlement, seller will, within 5 days of receiving the notice and or assessment, provide a copy of the notice and or assessments to buyer, and will notify buyer in writing that the seller will A, fully comply with the notice and or assessments at buyer's expense before settlement. If seller fully complies with the notice and or assessments, buyer will then accept the property and agree to release in paragraph 28 of the agreement. Or buyer will not comply, or seller will not comply with the notice and or assessment. If seller chooses not to comply with the notice and or assessment, or fails within the stated time to notify the buyer whether the seller will comply, buyer will notify the seller in writing within 5 days that the buyer will comply with the notices and assessments at buyer's expense, accepting the property, and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement, or terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller, with all deposit monies returning to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of this agreement. If buyer fails to respond within the time stated in paragraph 15A2, so that's 5 days, or fails to terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller within that time, buyer will accept the property and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. If required by law, within 30 days of the execution date of the agreement, but in no case later than 15 days prior to settlement, seller will order at seller's expense a certification from the appropriate municipal department disclosing notice of any uncorrected violations of zoning, housing, building safety, or fire ordinance, and or a certification permitting occupancy of the property. Buyer will receive a notice of any required repairs or improvements. Buyer will promptly deliver a copy of the notice to the seller. Now, I have to say that last sentence to me is backwards. The seller ordered it. The seller is the first one who gets it. In my opinion, that last sentence should say, seller will promptly deliver a copy of the notice to the buyer. Because the only way for the buyer to get it is because the seller had to send it to him, because the seller ordered it. But I'm only a girl, so what do I know? Within 5 days of receiving notice from a municipality of repairs or improvements are required, seller will deliver a copy of the notice to the buyer and notify the buyer in writing that the seller would. So what are these, what is this part of the paragraph talking about? What certifications is this seller getting?
City cert or 3407?
Nope. We're talking about use and occupancy or a CO. CO is for new construction, and the other is use and occupancy. Within 5 days of receiving notice from the municipality of repairs or improvements, seller will deliver a copy of the notice to the buyer and notify buyer in writing that the seller will make the required repairs or improvements to the satisfaction of the municipality. If seller makes the required repairs or improvements, buyer accepts the property and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. Or seller will not make the required repairs or improvements. If seller chooses not to make the required repairs or improvements, buyer will notify the seller in writing within 5 days that the buyer will accept a temporary access certification or temporary use and occupancy certification, agree to release in paragraph 28 of the agreement, and make the repairs at buyer's expense after settlement, or terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller, with all deposit monies returning to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of this agreement. If buyer fails to respond within the time stated in paragraph 15B1B, which is 5 days, or fails to terminate this agreement with written notice to the seller within that time, buyer will accept the property and agree to release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. And buyer accepts the responsibility to perform the repairs and or improvements according to the terms of the notice provided by the municipality. If repaired improvements are required and seller fails to provide a copy of the notice to the buyer, as required in this paragraph, seller will perform all repairs and improvements as required by the notice at seller's expense. So we got to get our use and occupancy. Now I'm going to tell you guys, most of you are newer agents, and I understand money can be tight. I get it. But you're foolish. You're very foolish not to use our transactional coordinator. For $195, her job is to make sure that the use and occupancy or the CO have been ordered. When you're dealing outside of the city, these municipalities will have you running in the woods like your hair's on fire, screaming. There could be as many as 5, 6, or 7 vendors that have to go out to that property to confirm that the property is safe, such as plumbing, electrical, heating, roofing, chimney, and God knows what else. How do you possibly know this? How do you know to get all of those as the listing agent? And to find out now you can't close on time because you didn't do it right. Think about this. It's too much. The other thing is when you actually kind of get the hang of this and you've been in the business for about 3 years and you're actually doing a pretty good job. You may have as many as 3, 5, 7 transactions going at a time. Do you think you have the capability to keep the pipeline full and handle all this paperwork? No. I know you think you're fabulous, but you're not that fabulous. And there are going to be mistakes. Things are going to fall through the cracks. And it's going to bite you. So be very careful with that. Okay? Let's move on. We're going to talk about condominiums. Condominiums and planned communities. This property is not a condominium or part of a planned community unless checked below. What is a condominium? A condominium, the property is a unit of a condominium that is primarily run by Unit Owners Association, known as a 3407. It is important you understand these numbers. Condominiums are known as 3407s of the Uniform Condominium Act of Pennsylvania, requiring sellers to furnish buyers with certification of resale and copies of the condominium declaration, other than plots and plans, the bylaws, and the rules and regulations of the association. All of this has to be sent over in the time frame indicated to the buyer. This cannot be piecemealed. If it's coming piecemealed, you need to identify with the listing agent, hang on, I am not getting all of the required documents in a timely fashion. Until I get all of the documents in the timely fashion indicated, the clock is not going to be ticking away as far as the time frame for my buyer to review. Okay, so remember, listing agents are hoping you're Stu Nod and you don't understand how this game is played. And they said, oh, We sent the bylaws and the rules and regulations. Really? Well, where's the 3407? Oh, you didn't get that? Well, let me go look for that. See, got to pay attention. Really important. Planned community, known as a homeowners association. The property is part of a planned community as defined by the Uniform Planned Community Act. This act is known as a 5407. Now, when it was a condominium, it was a 3407. Now we're talking about a homeowners association, and there's quite a few of them in the city. That is a 5407. Of the act requires the seller to furnish buyer with a copy of the declaration, other than plots and plans, the bylaws, and the rules and regulations of the association, and the certificate containing the provisions that set forth in the section of the 5407 Act. You got to get all these parts. The following applies to initial sales of a properties that are part of a condominium or planned community. If this is the first sale, underline that. If this is the first sale of the property after creation of the condominium or planned community, therefore a sale by declaration, seller shall furnish the buyer with the public offering statement no later than the date the buyer executes this agreement. Now, I'm going to tell you something. The odds of you getting the public offering statement prior to you writing this agreement for this property are pretty slim. See, developers can't wait to put that shovel in the ground. They can't wait to drop that foundation. They can't wait to stick it up. They can't wait to have it inspected and get this taken care of. Of which the issue then becomes your buyer doesn't get their public offering statement because the attorney and their pretty boilerplate was lazy and didn't have it done in time. To keep the developer's feet to the fire, add in on page 14 of the agreement that this is contingent, this agreement is contingent on the buyer receiving and agreeing to the public offering statement prior to closing. The public offering statement is a boilerplated type of condo doc. It's kind of like about the rules and regs and how the condominium is going to function until 50% of it is sold. At 50% sale of the project, the developer turns over the association to the condominium owners, and a condo committee is then formed. Until then, this is a loosey-goosey kind of condo docs. So if your buyer needs to review them, just as they need to review condo docs to find out if they can live by the bylaws, the rules and regulations. Many, many, many years ago, probably 25 years ago, I sold a condominium to a mature woman up in the Northeast. And when she got her condo docs, she read them. The condo docs said that each unit is entitled to 4 passes to the pool. She had 4 grandchildren. She needed a 5th one for herself. The condominium would not give her a 5th one. And for that reason, the contract became null and void. You actually have to read these things. I know it's a novel concept. Okay. It goes on to say that buyer may void this agreement within 15 days if condominium, or 7 days if it's a part of a planned community. So the buyer has 15 days to review the public offering statements and 7 days to review the public offering statements if it's a planned community. After receipt of the public offering statement or any amendments to the statement that materially or adversely affect the buyer, upon buyer declaring this agreement void, all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer according to the terms of the agreement. Now, in Philadelphia, we have 3 co-ops. I believe it's 3 co-ops. Is it 3, Dawn?
Yeah, I think that there's only the 3.
Yeah, that's all.
And there's only
Yeah. 1919 Chestnut,
19
Kennedy,
Kennedy and,
somebody else.
yeah, because I never work with co-ops.
Right.
I just with them.
Now, if you are involved in a co-op, remember we talked about a 3407 and we talked about a 5407? Well, guess what? Co-ops have bylaws too, and they're known as a 4409. 4409. It's what is called when you're dealing with a co-op. Now, Section C is really important here. The following applies to resales of properties that are part of a condominium. And this is where things get crazy. Within 15 days from the execution date of the agreement, seller, at seller's expense, will request from the association a certification of resale and any other documentation necessary to enable the seller to comply with the relevant act. The act provides that the association is required to provide these documents within 10 days of the seller's request. So let's try to figure this out. What is the maximum amount of time it could be for a seller to see any condo docs from the execution date?
$25.
That's right, 25 days. You're absolutely correct. The seller has 15 days to get them ordered. Once he orders them, the association has 10 days to produce them. If you're doing a cash transaction, you could have your buyer sitting at the closing table looking at the condo docs. It then says, seller will promptly deliver to buyer all documents received from the association. Under the act, the seller is not liable to the buyer for the failure of the association to provide the certificates in a timely manner, or for any incorrect information provided by the association in the certificate. The act provides that the buyer may declare this agreement void at any time before buyer receives the association's documents and for 5 days after. The buyer has 5 days to review the documents or until settlement, whichever occurs first. Buyer notice to the seller must be in writing. Upon buyer declaring the agreement void, all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of this agreement. If the association has the right to buy, known as the right of first refusal, and the association exercises that right, seller will reimburse the buyer for any costs accrued by the buyer for any inspections or certifications obtained according to the terms of the agreement, and the costs accrued for the buyer for title, search, title insurance, or mechanical insurance, or any fees for cancellation, flood, fire, hazard, or mining insurance, or any fees for cancellation, appraisal fees, and charges paid in advance to the mortgage lender. What does that paragraph mean? If a condominium perhaps has a unit that is commercial and has made a business decision that when that unit becomes available, they are going to purchase it. The seller sells it himself without a realtor and then has to ask for the condo docs. Once the association finds out that that property is in an agreement of sale, they can exercise their first right of refusal and bump out that buyer. That buyer can lose the opportunity to purchase that condominium due to the fact that that unit had a first right of refusal attached to it in the docs. And then the seller is responsible to pay back the buyer any costs that the buyer had accrued to get to that point. Sellers think they're so fabulous. Believe me when I tell you, they're not so fabulous. All right, home warranty. At or before settlement, either party may purchase a home warranty for the property from a third-person vendor. Buyer and seller understand that a home warranty for the property does not alter any disclosure requirements of the seller and will not cover or warrant any pre-existing defects to the property and will not alter, waive, or extend any provisions of this agreement regarding inspection or certifications that the buyer has elected or waived as part of the agreement. Buyer and seller understand that a broker who recommends a home warranty may have a business relationship with the home warranty company that provides a financial benefit to the broker. All right, kids, that's it for today. Who knew this agreement of sale was so tough? Like, who knew? Right? All right, we'll start with recordings on page 12 next week.
Thank you, Vicki.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Vicki.
See you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks.